Hi all, welcome to the second video looking at urban geography. In this video we're going to be looking more specifically at some of the urban changes that we've seen in Glasgow, and specifically looking at the urban changes that have happened to housing in Glasgow. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, this is the part where it gets very specific as to the kinds of stuff that the SQ are going to be looking at in terms of exam questions. So without further ado, let's get going. Now, first, we need, a little bit of definition work. We talk about urban decay in Glasgow, or, the decline of Glasgow as an urban area and things like that. Now, what we're meaning by that is the declining living standards, employment opportunities and facilities, and we're commonly looking at this type of decline happening more predominantly in the inner city, although it could happen in a number of areas. Now, typically, if this is going to happen, it's a kind of a bust following a boom. And this is very much the case with Glasgow. Glasgow's seen, a kind of 100 years or so, where it was rising in preeminence as an extremely important city, largely because of its success in heavy industry and heavy manufacturing, particularly with shipbuilding, and particularly acting as a port from the United Kingdom to the Americas. Now, in Glasgow, in the period from 1910 onwards, we started to see signs of the bust coming, of the bubble bursting. And this became particularly noteworthy post-World War II. Once World War II ended, you had issues in the Clyde with Glasgow, and it had been very severely bombed during the war, so that had an impact on the shipbuilding facilities that were there. We also start to see the rise of other economies, particularly the Indian economy and the Southeast Asian economies, as competitors to Glasgow in manufacturing. And because many of these places could compete with Glasgow in terms of quality of work, and they were a lot cheaper due to suppressed wages and things like that, it meant that Glasgow really fell into decline in terms of its shipbuilding. Now, we've kind of mentioned a few of these already. So what caused this urban decline to happen in Glasgow? So as I've said, the loss of heavy industry in Glasgow had a huge impact. It leads to extremely high unemployment, and that is a very, very noteworthy issue, as that then leads into a lot of the other issues that we talk about. Now, to compound this, the existing infrastructure that was built in Glasgow wasn't fit for purpose. Many of the houses and the services that were built in the area were built very much in the quickest and cheapest way that they could possibly be built. The tenement housing that was put in place was designed to have multiple families in single-room flats and apartments. They tended to have outside lavatories, outside toilets. You've got huge issues with overcrowding, with sanitation, and this can lead to disease. In these areas as well, you tended to find that you've got people who are on extremely low incomes live in the areas, and you've got people on low incomes who are attracted to the areas by low rents and things like that. And they are then caught in this kind of cycle of poverty, where they live in an extremely poor area, they get extremely poorly paying jobs, they can't afford to send their children to school, so they don't gain an education. Their children then enter poorly paying jobs to try and help, one, keep the family afloat, and two, because they can't gain access to any more well-paying jobs, and then they can only afford to live in this area, and the cycle continues. You also seen the people who did live in the inner city areas of Glasgow, who had a bit more money, who could afford to leave, did, and it was kind of very much the writing being on the wall. And there were also instances of governmental neglect, where areas like inner city Glasgow wasn't given government funding back when it really needed it, and it wasn't given it on the notion that this money could be spent in other areas that would have a higher chance of resulting in a positive story for the government to report on at the time. Now, how were these issues managed? And this tends to be where a lot of the questions come in. They tend to ask you more about what were the management strategies that were used and how are these management strategies effective. So first, we've got comprehensive development areas. This is the most simplistic way you can think about dealing with a problem area. Bulldoze the whole thing to the ground and rebuild it. Now, in Glasgow, this really looked at, build the inner ring road around Glasgow city centre and extend the M8 and the M77, and this led to these two motorways cutting through suburbs, the inner city and Glasgow's CBD. Now that was problematic because, you're basically putting a major motorway through residential areas in some places, and that causes issues for the people living in those areas that you can be cutting communities quite literally in half. We also seen over 300 blocks of high-rise flats being put up in Glasgow, and these were extremely, extremely poorly put together in a lot of cases. Yes, okay, there may have been the odd one that was well put together, but for the most part, these were not a great idea. Now, overall, clearing away an area, running the bulldozers in and all the rest of it is fairly straightforward, and it's cheap and all the rest of it. However, building homes that are going to replace the ones you've demolished at a superior standard takes time and it is expensive. Now, in and amongst a lot of this, there was extremely poor planning practices. You had family groups and communities split up, and this led to, particularly in a lot of the high-rises, increases in rates of crime, increases in rates of social isolation, increases in rates of drug and alcohol abuse. And overall, you've seen living standards decline dramatically in a lot of these areas. Something slightly different and slightly more effective is the notion of urban regeneration. Now, if we look at the previous example, the CDAs, and that's the idea of total clearance and it being extremely expensive, urban regeneration is more of a targeted approach. So if a building is so dilapidated that it has to come down, yes, you tear it down. If, however, it's in a state where, it needs to have better sanitation provided, it needs to have its roof repaired, it needs to have some windows repaired, things like that, you do the repairs and you save the buildings. Lots of the tenements that were built in Glasgow structurally were extremely well-built buildings, a lot of them built of sandstone and stuff like this, and they are well put together, and just demolishing them was, if nothing else, a waste of resources. Now, this is obviously much more sustainable, and it's much less expensive, which means that it is a much more effective method of solving some of the housing problems that Glasgow faced. Another method is developing the rural-urban fringe, or developing greenbelt land. Now, this involves taking the people that need to move out of the inner city because the conditions there are, frankly, inadequate for people to live in properly, and moving them to other areas. And in the Glasgow context, we've seen 200,000 people moved into areas like Drumchapel, Castlemilk, Pollock and Easterhouse. Now, this met with mixed success. Some of the houses provided, or most of them, were certainly of a higher standard than what was left behind. However, we still had issues with families and communities being split up, facilities not being put in alongside houses like shops and doctors and schools and whatnot. And if the people still worked in the city centre, you sometimes didn't have the transport infrastructure to get these people into their work in an effective manner. Another method, very, very similar to moving to the rural-urban fringe, but moving it slightly further away from the cities, is looking at building new towns. Now, these were very effective. This was something where you had real planning went in, and you had 5 new towns were built: Irvine, East Kilbride, Cumbernauld, Livingston and Glenrothes. Now, these were well planned, and they had set areas for different land uses, residential areas, shopping areas, etc. Now, this helped to rehome an additional 300,000 people that couldn't fit into the CDAs that were already being dealt with. One thing to bear in mind with the CDAs, when they did demolish these areas, one of the things that Glasgow's inner city had before it was demolished was an extremely high population density. You've got lots and lots of people living in very, very small areas, and that's obviously not positive. The CDAs, even when they built the high-rises, you still didn't meet that same high population density, so you had people that had to move to other areas, like the new towns. Now, one of the big advantages, or one of the big draws that these new towns had, is that they had a lot more space for families and for children to grow in. You're talking about parks, you're talking about gardens, and this made them extremely attractive, and it made them extremely positive, and this was a successful strategy. Another one, gentrification, is going into the inner city and redeveloping some of the old and dilapidated stuff that is in there with extremely high quality luxury accommodation or high quality bars, cafes, restaurants, etc. Now, the Merchant City in Glasgow is the big example of this, and if it's an area that if you ever visit it, you will see that you've got lots of buildings that used to be used as things like the old salt market, for instance, that is now used for, it's high profile bars, cafes, bistros, all this type of stuff that brings a lot of money into the area, and the people who can afford to move into the flats, etc. in these areas as well also bring money with them. Now, the last of the kind of generic overall projects that we're going to look at is just events and projects in and of themselves. And these are things where you put on a show, for lack of a better word, that is going to bring things with it that will help to address the poverty, poor health, unemployment in the area. Now, Glasgow's had many of these over the years. One of the big ones that I'll talk about now briefly, if you think about the Commonwealth Games. The Commonwealth Games are put on in Glasgow, and a lot of the stuff that was built in Glasgow's East End, an extremely deprived area of the city. And a lot of the stuff that's built, like the velodrome and things like that, they have a legacy, and it's something that's talked about with any of these events in any city that they happen in now. It has to be about what will the legacy of your event be? What will it do long term for the people who live in that area? And it's all about providing services, providing jobs, providing infrastructure. And these are the types of things that when you build these stadiums or when you build the athletes' village or things like this, there has to be a plan in place for how they will be continually supported in the long term and how they will help to improve the area that you've built them in. Now, what I'm going to do for the next and the last kind of couple of minutes of this video is quickly talk through how specific areas in Glasgow have benefited from some of these schemes. Now, the Gorbals in Glasgow, was the home to hundreds of thousands of people. It was back in the early 19th century. You had, literally hundreds of thousands of people who both lived and worked in the area, and they worked largely in the heavy industry and the shipbuilding in the area. Now, by the time you hit the kind of 1920s, the area started to go into decline and the middle classes started to leave. By the time you hit the 1950s, it was held as one of the worst slum areas in Europe with some of the lowest living standards in Europe. So, Glasgow City tried to think of how can we improve this, and it became one of the first CDAs, or the sites of one of the first CDAs. Hutcheston was identified as an area where they were going to clear it all out, clear the tenements in the area, and build a selection of high-rise flats. Now, this was disastrous, frankly. The flats were very, very poorly built and they weren't well maintained. They lasted less than 20 years before they were then demolished. After this, you've had a slightly more positive approach where modern tenement or low-rise style flats have been built in the area, which are at a much, much higher standard and they're much, much more well-maintained, and they're aimed at kind of young professionals. And this has meant the area now is much higher living standards and generally is a much, much more affluent area than it was at some points in its history. The Red Road Flats is another example of a similar programme that was put in place. In 1996, these flats were built to house just shy of 5,000 people. They were extremely unpopular because, one, they were very, very poorly built. There was a lot of asbestos used in the building, and as much as historically we've used asbestos as a building material, we know now that it's a very, very dangerous one to use. They weren't well maintained and the crime rate was extremely high. And, in the end, this led to the Red Road Flats being demolished, and that was completed by 2015. Easterhouse is an example of one of these areas that we've built in the urban fringe, and we're talking about, in the 50s, trying to house 50,000 people. It lacked amenities in a massive way. You've got all of these people and you don't have enough services like shops, schools, all the rest of it. And without the investment that this community needed, you see life expectancy drop, you see poverty rates rise, you see crime rates rise, you see social isolation rise, you see substance abuse rise as well. This needed action, and by the time we hit the 1990s and onwards, there has been action done to try and bring living standards in the area up by providing higher quality accommodation, higher quality housing, and bringing in higher quality, higher quality services and amenities. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about today, guys, just as I come at the end of the video, is the successes in the Clyde Waterfront, and we're talking about all the things we've got on the screen here and how they have brought in jobs, investment, services, and generally increased the standards along the Clyde in Glasgow. Now, I'm dramatically about to run out of time, guys, so I'm going to wind this up here, and we can continue to talk about this after the prelims. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Bye.